We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The entire federal government could be tipped onto its head. That's the stakes that were at play in the United States Supreme Court this week. Now, with us, we have a giggling Scott D. Cosenza, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the Excellent Uprising podcast. And he's giggling because this case, Scott, and thank you for being here, this case, you and I have discussed it a lot. It's to do with the Chevron deference. And most people's eyes kind of glaze over when you start talking about, not when you start talking about what it is, when people start talking about what it is. But it's actually, for people who have a love of limited government and perhaps even a bit of schadenfreude at getting back at the overreach of government, this is the case for them, isn't it, Scott?
I'll just tell you the facts of the case that got us here, Mark. A fisherman has to have a federal monitor on his boat, and he has to pay for it. And that comes out of the money he makes from selling the fish. Now, the Congress never passed a law that said fishermen have to pay for these monitors and they have to be put on their boats. That's what the federal government agency assessment of the law said. So the fisherman says, hey, listen, you're cutting into a huge portion of my profits. Being a small family-run fishing business is not, replete with stacks and stacks of cash in the United States of America. It's a getting by kind of a lifestyle, right? And the culture. And yet it's going to be destroyed maybe because of this agency interpretation. I'm laughing only because it's almost preposterous that the power that these agencies have assumed, and that's what this case is about, and that's why it's animating and exciting for so many on the sort of right wing, if you will, or the limited government side, because we think this is a huge potential win for limited government if the court votes in a certain way.
Let me recap this then, just so we've got the very clear details. It's not necessarily about the guy with his fishing boat as such, because what it's doing, the federal government, the agency in control of it, took it upon themselves to pass a law without Congress. And that is
a regulation which has the force of law, and I think it's an important
regulation that has the force of law.
The law was passed by Congress, and Congress said, you regulate this fishery, okay?
Yeah.
That's one thing that they can do.
And so agencies, all federal agencies, they are putting out regulations without going through Congress, but these regulations have the force of law. So you can be fined and or even presumably imprisoned over something that a government agency, not Congress, has decided this is what we want to happen. Is that about right?
Well, let's just take it out of the criminal context for a moment and say, yes, you're right.
Okay,
and
so this case is now up, and this is regards to what's called the Chevron deference.
And that pertains to the oil company. That's what it's named after, a previous case decades previously when the Supreme Court ruled in the case called Chevron that executive agencies were to be given deference in their interpretation of a statute or their own rules meanings. And what this case stands for is the possibility that may all go away. And again, to the gain and accrual of individual liberty and individual right, because this is a power shifting potential, Mark, a massive power shift away from the executive agencies of the federal government and over to the courts, who can then dispense that power to the people to say, for instance, no, if Congress wants you to have to spend 20% of your take-home pay on federal monitors, they can pass a law that says it rather than having an agency kind of interpret or assume that that's an okay.
If I may jump in on this, the advantage in terms of liberty of that, sending that to Congress and saying if Congress wants that law, Congress has to pass it, is that the people in Congress have to justify why they're taking more money from a small business owner, and it would be a very brave politician who goes against.
The words you're looking for are political accountability.
Oh yeah, that is exactly what I'm looking for.
That is what the Congress wishes to avoid, perhaps, if we have an uncharitable view of some in the legislature. And what agencies are happy to have the power, and they don't have the accountability. Who are you going to fight? You know, you write a letter
Yeah.
to some nameless, faceless person at an agency. Everybody throws up their hands and says, "Well, what can you do?"
So that was heard. The arguments were heard in court today, when the day that we're recording this, which is Wednesday, the 17th of January. Now, you seemed quite animated. You are literally just off listening to the arguments, and we're recording, and you seemed quite animated, almost excited. Why is that, Scott?
Well, I mean, you know, it's a staid kind of experience listening to oral arguments.
Sure.
There's no video involved, so it's just the words as they come across the audio. I thought that I'm a person who's rooting for a certain and particular outcome here. I think that we have far too much deference given to agencies, and also that ambiguities in the law should be determined in favor of the individual. And so if there's a law that's passed, and I just think of, for instance, some of the more egregious examples in that I think of have to do with, like, somebody's land gets that they call it a wetland, you know, and because it gets wet sometimes when it rains or something like that. And Congress has many priorities, and they want to regulate and pass laws in certain areas, and they don't consider the people on the very margins who don't actually have a wetland, but you know, they've got a back 40 that they grow whatever in, and guess what? Maybe they sell something from that patch of land that funds an important part of their lifestyle or something like that. And it's just the individual getting crushed by government over and over, which happens with every one of these types of regulations. There are people on the margins whose circumstances aren't well considered, and those people should have the courts fighting, you know, or not fighting for them, but when they fight the agencies in court, they should get a fair hearing before that court. And that court should say, hey, look, your rule says X, and this ain't X. But that's not what we have now. Now we have the court saying your rule says X, but you, the agency, says X really includes some of Y and just a touch of Z. Well, I don't think that should be the rule. So I'm hoping that will change. And the reason for my excitement is because of my kind of keying in on what I'm thinking the justices rather are thinking, and how they may rule based on their questions.
Now, I believe Justice Gorsuch had some interesting questions.
Well, Justice Gorsuch and General, so the case was argued by the government side by Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar, who I think is a delight and a great Solicitor General and advocate before the court, even when I disagree with her, which is almost 100% of the time. So she just, you know, a well-prepared person who's arguing against you is much better than somebody who's, you know, not as well-prepared. And she's an 11 out of 10 with that. And I just enjoyed her back and forth with Justice Gorsuch, and him pointing out how there seemed to be an impetus, both with respect to Ketanji Brown Jackson and Elizabeth Prelogar. Ketanji Brown Jackson, with some of her questions to the opposing counsel, the fisheries, the fisherman's lawyer, if you will, that this wasn't that big a deal, that the courts didn't confront this that often. It wasn't, you know, such a struggle. And Justice Gorsuch mentioned that a dozen, at least, I can't remember if he said district court judges or circuit court judges, wrote the Supreme Court asking them for a change in this law, and really bringing it to the Solicitor General, whose kind of mindset was sort of, things are, you know, there's some bumps in the road, but things are running well with this. There's a mend it, don't end it kind of an attitude for some of them. And that's said explicitly as something that they're arguing for. And Justice Gorsuch seems to be arguing in his questions that he doesn't favor the mend it, don't end it. And that's something that I think the court should do, is to not try to mend something that's, you know, far off the tracks, but go ahead and end a bad policy.
Hit me with the prediction, Scott.
Mark, you know, I hate to give predictions, but based on the questions I saw today, I think we will see a kind of split along traditional party lines, 6-3, the Republican appointees versus the Democrat appointees, and that's my guess as to how it'll pan out.
Scott DeCosenza, thanks ever so much for joining us. And that's just about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you, and thank you to our guests this week, Tim Donner, longtime host of this here radio show, and Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Scott DeCosenza. We'll keep on watching the skies for the 2024 election. You can check out our coverage on the pages of libertynation.com or check out our new and improved Roku channel, Liberty Nation News, where it's all happening. Thanks for being here. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.